Before Adolf Hitler became a name that would be carved into the darkest chapters of human history, he was just another forgotten figure drifting through the cracks of society. A man sleeping in shelters, standing in soup kitchen lines, carrying sketches that no one wanted to buy, and carrying within him something far more dangerous than poverty. Not power, not wealth, but obsession, and the terrifying belief that the world had wronged him beyond repair. This is not the story of how a monster is born in a moment. It is the story of how disappointment, identity, ideology, and timing can collide to reshape the fate of millions. In his early life, Hitler was not seen as a leader in the making. He was restless, struggling to find direction, and often clashed with authority. He dreamed of being an artist and moved to Vienna, hoping to be accepted into an art academy. That dream collapsed more than once, leaving him stranded in a city that did not care about his ambitions. Vienna was where he spent years living on the edge of survival, drifting between temporary shelters and cheap lodging houses. He observed the world around him closely, especially the divisions between rich and poor, locals and immigrants, powerful and powerless. Instead of turning inward to rebuild himself, he began forming rigid and increasingly hostile ideas about society, identity, and blame. During these years, something important began to take shape. He was not simply suffering from poverty. He was building a worldview. He spent hours reading, listening to political debates in cafes, and absorbing extremist pamphlets that were circulating in Europe at the time. Instead of seeing complexity in human struggles, he began searching for simple explanations. He found them in radical nationalist and anti-Semitic ideas that were spreading in parts of Austrian society. These ideas did not create his resentment, but they gave it structure, language, and direction. When he later moved to Munich, his life remained unstable, but the world around him was changing rapidly. Europe was approaching a period of intense political and economic instability. After the First World War, Germany was humiliated, economically weakened, and socially fractured. Many citizens felt betrayed, angry, and desperate for change. In this environment, voices that promised restoration, pride, and revenge began to gain attention. Hitler, who had once been a silent observer of society, started to find his voice in this chaos. He entered politics not as a polished statesman, but as a speaker. His strength was not in policy or intellect in the traditional sense, but in emotional persuasion. He understood how to speak to frustration, how to transform uncertainty into anger, and how to turn personal grievance into collective identity. At small gatherings in beer halls, he began to attract attention. People did not come for solutions at first, they came for conviction, and he delivered it with intensity that was rare and unsettling. As his influence grew, so did his ability to manipulate the political instability around him. He joined a small political movement that would eventually evolve into something far larger and more dangerous. He helped reshape its identity, its message, and its structure. What began as a fringe group slowly transformed into a mass movement fueled by propaganda, discipline, and a carefully constructed narrative of national rebirth. But the rise was not linear. There were failures, setbacks, and even imprisonment after a failed attempt to seize power. It was during this period that he reflected and reorganized his strategy. Instead of relying on force alone, he began to focus on legality, propaganda, and mass persuasion. He studied how crowds behave, how fear spreads, and how repetition can shape belief. When he returned to politics, he was not just an agitator, he was a strategist. Economic collapse and political instability in Germany gave him the opportunity he needed. Unemployment was high, trust in institutions was low, and people were searching for someone to restore order. Hitler positioned himself as that figure, not as one option among many, but as the only solution. His messaging became sharper, more controlled, and more emotionally charged. He did not just promise change, he promised transformation. Once he gained political power, the nature of his leadership changed dramatically. The movement that had grown around promises of unity and revival quickly shifted into something far more oppressive. Institutions were reshaped to serve a single ideology. Opposition was eliminated. Propaganda became a central tool of governance, controlling information and reinforcing loyalty. Fear and control replaced debate and dissent. What makes this transformation historically significant is not just how quickly it happened, but how systematically it was executed. The mechanisms of state, law, media, and education were aligned to support one vision of society. Those who were targeted were dehumanized first in language, then in policy, and eventually in action. This progression did not happen overnight, but step by step, with each stage normalizing the next. As power consolidated, Germany was pushed toward aggressive expansion and war. The consequences of these decisions would become catastrophic on a global scale, leading to immense destruction and loss of life across continents. The same man who once stood in soup kitchens and struggled for survival had become the center of one of the most devastating political regimes in modern history. But perhaps the most disturbing part of this story is not just the rise itself. It is how ordinary conditions contributed to it. Economic despair, national humiliation, political instability, and social division created an environment where extreme ideas could take root. Hitler did not rise in isolation. He rose in a system that was vulnerable to manipulation, where fear could outweigh reason and where hope could be redirected into hatred. History does not present this story as destiny. It presents it as a warning, a reminder that individuals can change the course of nations, but also that societies can create the conditions for their own downfall when they abandon critical thinking, empathy, and resilience against extremism. From a homeless drifter to a figure of immense destructive power, Hitler's journey is not a story of inspiration. It is a study of how fragile the balance is between chaos and control, and how quickly a society searching for answers can be led into darkness when those answers are built on hatred instead of truth.